to be with everyone. When people ask me how I got into this field, sometimes reporters ask that question. I usually, with a slight wink in my eye, I usually say my career started in the back of a police car. That as an adolescent, I and a couple of friends were doing something very unwise, trying to steal something, and ended up being in the back of the car and taken downtown. And it was the first time when my father showed up to pick us up, was the first time I was unable to make him smile. And that was more punishing to me than anything the police had said or done. But I remember then when my career started, I was an undergraduate in Eugene, and I was an intern at the juvenile court in Eugene. And I remember thinking, who designed this? The whole approach seemed to be to tell young people, you better behave or we'll come after you. And I thought, who came up with this as a theory of how to influence the behavior of an adolescent? That made no sense to me. And I always tell people that the most amazing thing about adolescents is they don't care what we think. And that both allows them to survive and grow and change society, and makes it really difficult when they're making mistakes and getting into trouble, because they don't listen to us as adults. So how do we tap into what they would listen to, what would shape behavior? And that's where this whole idea comes from. Okay. All right. So we call this positive youth justice. A couple colleagues and I were reacting to, in the early part of this century, and even in the 90s, research started coming out that talked about adolescent development, positive youth development, and the concepts and the science behind it made a lot of sense, but it wasn't often translated for the justice environment. So a lot of psychologists were writing, and it seemed like they thought the audience were parents and teachers and people in what I would call privileged communities. And how do we take these lessons and all this knowledge coming out about positive youth development and adapt it for the world we were all working in, which was a challenge. So we wrote this report and published it, you can see, more than 10 years ago with the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, and tried to bridge those two worlds, from adolescent development, all the research coming out about adolescent development, and the worlds of practice and policy in the justice setting. And we came up with several things. The inspiration for this was the research that was coming out showing that youth with pro-social assets are less likely to be involved in risky behavior. And this concept of assets turned out to be pivotal. When people have things in their life which compel them and pull them into a positive adulthood, it's a lot easier to resist all the temptations and the impulses to misbehave as an adolescent. Those assets included a sense of belonging, a sense of attachment, and engagement with other people. And sometimes when law enforcement people tell me the problem with young people is they don't know the difference between right and wrong, I always say, oh, yes, they do. They've just embraced a very different concept of what you might mean by right and wrong, but they know exactly what behavior is tolerated and won't be tolerated within their social networks, their friendship networks, and their neighborhoods. So you have to pay attention to that and adapt to it, and not believe that everyone has lived the life you're living. Also, one of the biggest challenges is positive youth justice. To do it well, it's not a program which you can hire out or sign up a vendor to be a subcontractor to do the program. It's much more complicated than that. And that's what undermines a lot of efforts. When people embrace the idea of positive youth justice, they soon realize that it takes a lot of interaction with different sectors and organizations and bureaucracy. And you can't just have a vendor set up and do the program as if it were a therapeutic one-on-one program. And underlying all this is the insight that all youth need the same stuff that young people in wealthy communities have and take for granted. That is supportive relationships, being rewarded for work, being recognized for an effort and new skills. I always say I wish every young person every day had someone say to them, wow, how did you learn to do that? That's amazing. So being rewarded for work, success in learning, not just in the classroom, but in general. Also the ability to have physical activity. It's important for all of us, but during adolescence, it's critical for social development, physical development, and the ability to be involved in music and the arts, which I think is very important. And sometimes adults don't get that. Community and political involvement to grow into having a role to play. And then the one that I think is most often ignored is excitement, fun, and adventure. If you're not ensuring that adolescents have that in their life, they will find it some other way. That's how I ended up in the back of the police car. That was fun and exciting to us. But you need to recognize that. And all these basic insights, I think, lead to this framework of positive youth justice. One of the challenges of positive youth justice is the fact that so much of the early research came out of neuroscience and people who write about neuroscience. And it's important to know this, that when you study brain functioning in adolescence, now we know we have research showing, as it says here, that adolescents tend to have poor self-control, an emotionally charged situation, or easily influenced by peer, and don't think the consequences of their actions. Any parents in the room who are surprised by this? I don't think so. Also, the research now shows that adolescence is characterized by rapid growth in the brain areas focused on pleasure seeking, and as it says there, emotional reactivity. So it doesn't take much to prompt a reaction, and you all know that too. With slower development in the areas that govern self-control and judgment. Again, the only response is, duh, it's nice to have real credible research that shows this, but obviously this is now accepted judgment. And this is probably one of the more important ones, that with neuroscience research, they found that adversity and stress in the environment tends to downregulate, suppress the part of the brain that allows for adaptive behavior, and upregulate, overstimulate emotional systems that are important for guiding judgment and decision-making. So it's no surprise when you look at crime rates, arrest rates, that everything is increasing during the teenage years, peaks in the mid-20s, and then starts to decline, which is the exact graph you would have for intellectual development, neurological development, and it lines up perfectly with the crime rate and the number of people picked up for various offenses. So why are we shocked? So understanding brain and neuroscience did turn out to be critical for understanding and influencing adolescent behavior. But the downside or the danger is too many policymakers and practitioners too, when they heard this, assumed that criminal activity, law breaking, violating the rules as an adolescent was somehow about their brains. And people actually thought they were on the side of goodness and truth when they would talk about adolescent brains and decision making. And that started to govern the response of the justice system, which I would advise is a serious misstep, to think that you don't turn to the neurological science to create your justice system. But that was actually happening a lot during the 90s into, I would say, until we wrote this report. About that time, that's what we were reacting to, that too many people were just hearing brain science or neurology and assuming they had the secret to running a good justice system. And addressing substance abuse and mental health are certainly important for some young people and some families, but it's not sufficient for having a good, well-rounded justice system. And I'll show you what I mean. So we now have lots of research showing this. 20 years ago, Linda Teplin did a study looking at high quality mental health diagnostics in a detention center and found her number was 69%. I've seen it go as high as 80. In a locked facility detention center, that's the prevalence of diagnosable mental health and substance use disorders. So again, the policymakers who don't think deeply about these things thought, oh, now we have the answer. That's why they're all in there, because they have mental health disorders. And here's why it's a mistake. They forget the fact that in the general population, the prevalence of mental health disorders is 20%. So any kid anywhere in America, about 1 in 5, are going to have something diagnosable from mild depression on through more serious things. Then you go a little deeper into probation intake, which is after processing and so forth, after adjudication, and you're about half. And if you go to the front door of the justice system, they don't do screening literally at the front door, but if you go to data from this Juvenile Assessment Center study, it's about 29%. So you notice it's stepping up there. As you go deeper into the justice system, the justice process, young people show up with more and more diagnosable disorders. So what are we to infer from that? The same thing is true when you look at drug problems. Youth at that juvenile assessment center have a overall rate in that study of about 11%. So the front door of the justice system barely passed law enforcement, referred, first time begin a process about 11%. But it's 8% in the general population, this diagnosable substance abuse disorder. Let's go deeper in the system. Past the intake assessment onto being referred to probation, using national data, we know roughly about half of all youth referred to the court end up going to some kind of probation service. So I made that bar half as big. What's the prevalence of substance use disorders among the probation population? And you get 25%. You go a little deeper into the system, past probation into youth being held in a secure detention center. We know from national data about 1 in 5 cases of young people referred from law enforcement end up in detention. So I made that bar 1/5 the size of the first bar. What proportion of those have diagnosable substance use disorders? And using the Teplin study, we know it's about half. So what do we see here? Are these the same kids? So are we seeing evidence that substance use causes juvenile crime? Or are we seeing that the justice process tends to sort and sift and hold on to the kids with mental health and substance use disorder, which is perfectly appropriate if you have the resources to help young people and families with substance use and mental health disorders, but it's not a way to infer the causation of youth delinquency, youth law violations. And that's what was happening a lot around the country, where you quote these numbers. And I hear practitioners do this all the time. We know 80% of kids in the system have diagnosable mental health and substance use disorders. But the system, of course, is never defined. It often comes from studies of confined populations. So when you go into the deep end and some researcher does a screening of diagnosable disorders in the deep end, you'll find these high numbers. And then the politicians assume they've just learned something about causation, and they've learned why people are in the system. And it's because they have diagnosable disorders, which causes all the funding to flow into clinical models, cognitive behavioral therapy, family therapy, all the clinical stuff, because they think it's mental health, neurology, and substance abuse. And yes, those things are important. They're important tools in the toolbox, but that is not the answer for why we have so many kids being picked up by police and getting into trouble. You're not going to solve the problem just maximizing drug treatment and mental health treatment. And that gets tricky. So we have to think this through and think about the consequences for policy and for practice, and keep in mind that we need something other than mental health and substance abuse. And that's often harder than we think. So key questions, key elements are, how do we transform youth justice to focus on practical ways of facilitating what we know about youth development, attaching young people to positive assets and relationships? How do we create public-private partnerships? Because you cannot do what you need to do with all public agencies. So you need private contractors, you need partners, and that makes it more complicated and riskier and more bureaucratic. But you cannot just assign this, as you all know, to one big state agency who handles everything. That one big state agency should manage everything and keep on top of everything, but you need local government and you need private agencies as partners to do what is called for in a positive youth justice world. And then for my part of the world, my part of the system, I focus on the evidence that this is effective, because I know if we don't prove that these things actually help, the whole system will fall back on old ways of thinking. And the more recent old way of thinking is everyone needs psychotherapy. The old way of thinking before that, of course, which is still around, is that we need more confinement and more locked spaces and facilities, because these kids got to learn their lesson. And boy, there's nothing like sending them away from their families and locking them up. And if you don't prove that the good model works, we'll still end up with bad model. And so I think research has an important role to play here. So when we tried to summarize what positive youth justice was, we came up with these things, these 2 dimensions. The key assets are learning and doing, so skill development, learning how to do new things, being recognized for that, and attaching and belonging. Having people care about you, knowing you're part of the group, being recognized as being part of the group, this street crews know this. They know these two things are what you need to run an effective street crew. We should at least be as smart as they are and focus on the things that actually draw young people into positive futures. And then each of those things need to be done within these core dimensions. We labeled as work, education, relationships, community, health, and creativity. And that can be hard to do. One short story, I was visiting, I won't tell you who, but I was visiting a large private provider of residential treatment, and they told me how they were really building up their music program. And I thought, oh, that's fabulous. Music's very important to me. My parents were both music teachers. It really helped me through adolescence. I said, that's fabulous. Can I see it? So they take me into this room where I see these 40 or 50 predominantly youth of color standing on bleachers in front of their teacher, who was someone who looks like me, at least I do now. So 40 or 50 people, young people of color, standing there being what I would call forced to sing some old Bing Crosby Christmas carol. And I thought, you don't get it. That's not what music and expression is about. It's not about forcing them to embrace your culture. It's about having them express themselves. So that was frustrating. So it's easy for all these things to be misinterpreted and misused, but those are the core components we came up with. The other thing we noticed is it's hard in systems to adapt if they hold on to their old views of youth. So we wrote this is one image in that report, which just says how people see young people, how even policymakers and practitioners in the justice system, how they see young people. And it's viewing them as a resource is a radical idea, because the two primary ways in the justice system that young people are usually viewed is one of those first two columns. And the people who see kids as victims think they're on the side of goodness, and the ones who see kids as villains think they're on the side of goodness because they're protecting the community. But you got to break out of both of those and shift into seeing young people as capable of transforming our communities and becoming leaders and helping them develop the potential to do that, which is what positive youth justice should be. So lastly, this is the challenges are, how do we do this? How do we focus on assets in relationships when most of the data we have come from police, where we have our arrests, prosecutions? You can't run this system with just police data. How do we do this with multiple partners from multiple sectors, health, labor, education, housing? How do we do that? And that's complicated. Also, all those agencies must collaborate in collecting the data that we need as researchers to show that these things actually do result in positive futures for young people. Because if you don't prove it, again, people won't do it. People will fall back on the old ways of thinking. Politicians get rewarded for all those old ways, and all they care about is who votes for them. So it's really a challenge to prove that they need to break out of that and do something more positive. So multi-agency systems. And lastly, we did one more report, came out a few years ago, trying to lay out some of this and helping point the way for systems looking to follow this approach.